The Thanksgiving table was set, the turkey halfway to golden, when Walter and Mildred Hartfield vanished into the worst storm Ohio had ever seen. On November 26, 1950, the great Appalachian storm descended on Steubenville with winds that screamed at 110 miles per hour and snow that buried cars whole. Their farmhouse stood empty the next morning, the front door swinging on broken hinges, snow drifted across the kitchen floor, and a half-finished pumpkin pie cooling on the counter. No footprints led away from the house. No bodies were ever found. For 54 years, everyone believed the storm had taken them. Everyone was wrong. If you want to know how two people can disappear during one of America's deadliest blizzards and turn up alive more than half a century later, you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Walter James Hartfield was born in 1876 outside Mingo Junction, Ohio, when the town was finding its feet as a steel mill outpost. He married Mildred Ann Foster in 1898, and when her father died in 1904, they inherited 40 acres of rocky farmland north of Steubenville. They raised 4 children between 1899 and 1911, 3 boys and a girl. By 1950, Walter and Mildred had outlived their son Frank, killed in France during World War I. Their 3 surviving children had scattered to cities for steadier work. James Jr. worked as a machinist in Pittsburgh, Thomas managed a hardware store in Wheeling, and Ruth had married a pharmacist in Columbus. The farm had shrunk to just the homestead and 10 acres. The farmhouse sat a mile and a half from the nearest neighbor, accessed by a dirt road that turned to mud in spring and froze into ruts in winter. A stone chimney rose from the north side, and a covered porch wrapped around the front. A barn stood 50 yards behind the house, home to 2 dairy cows, a dozen chickens, and an aging plow horse named Duke. November 1950 arrived cold and dry. The Farmer's Almanac had predicted a mild winter, and early reports from the Weather Bureau in Pittsburgh suggested Thanksgiving week would bring clear skies. Walter spent the week chopping firewood and reinforcing the barn door. Mildred baked bread and prepared the house for their children's visit. All 3 had promised to arrive on Thanksgiving Day, bringing spouses and grandchildren Walter and Mildred hadn't seen since summer. The storm began forming on November 23rd over the Carolinas. A low-pressure system collided with cold air streaming down from Canada, and instead of tracking out to sea, this one turned northwest, gathering strength. By November 24th, it had intensified into something meteorologists had never documented before, a hybrid system combining blizzard conditions with hurricane-force winds. The first warnings reached Steubenville on the evening of November 24th, crackling over radio sets. Nobody panicked. Heavy snow meant 8 or 10 inches, not catastrophe. Walter listened while Mildred worked on her pumpkin pie, figuring the storm might delay their children's arrival by a few hours. November 25th dawned gray and cold. Walter went out to feed the animals at 6 in the morning and noticed the cloud cover looked wrong, too uniform and too low. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the wind carried moisture that promised snow. He spent the morning securing loose items, bringing in extra firewood, and checking storm shutters. The snow started around noon, light flurries that swirled and melted. By 2 o'clock, the flurries had thickened into steady snowfall, and the wind had picked up enough to make the house creak. Walter stood at the kitchen window watching the weather deteriorate and felt the first stirrings of real concern. Mildred tried calling their children using the party line telephone, but the lines were already jammed. She got through to Ruth in Columbus, who reported clear weather there but warnings of severe conditions developing. They agreed that if the storm worsened, the children would delay their trip. By 4 o'clock on November 25th, the snow was falling so heavily that Walter could barely see the barn from the kitchen window. The wind made the house shudder with each gust, and the temperature had plummeted into the teens. The party line telephone went dead at 4:30, and 20 minutes later, the electric power failed, plunging the house into early darkness. Walter lit kerosene lamps while Mildred stoked the fire in the wood stove. They'd weathered bad storms before, but something about this one felt different. The wind didn't just blow, it attacked, slamming against the house in waves that made the windows rattle. Snow wasn't falling anymore. It was driving horizontally, piling against the north side in drifts that grew inches per hour. They ate a cold supper by lamplight, leftover chicken and bread, listening to the storm rage. Around 8 o'clock, Walter pulled on his heavy coat and boots to check on the animals. Mildred tried to talk him out of it, but Walter was stubborn about his routines. He tied one end of a rope around his waist and the other to the porch railing, a precaution his father had taught him for navigating blizzards. He made it to the barn and back without incident. The animals were secure, though the cows were nervous. Duke seemed unperturbed by the chaos. Walter had filled their water trough and scattered extra hay. November 26th, Thanksgiving Day, arrived without any visible sign that it was morning. The world beyond the windows remained dark, choked with snow that fell so thick it seemed solid. The wind had reached a pitch that sounded like a continuous scream. Snowdrifts had completely buried the porch on the north side, and the front door was blocked halfway up. Walter and Mildred spent the morning in the kitchen, keeping the wood stove fed and melting snow for water, since the hand pump outside was inaccessible. They spoke little, both understanding that this storm had become something unprecedented. Around noon, they heard a different sound beneath the wind's roar, a sharp crack followed by a heavy thud that shook the house. Walter grabbed a lamp and investigated, finding that a large branch from the oak tree had snapped under ice and snow, crashing onto the porch roof. Water was dripping through the ceiling in the front room. They moved everything valuable away from the leak and set out buckets. The temperature inside the house had dropped to where they could see their breath, despite the wood stove burning continuously. Mildred worried about their firewood supply, now buried under snow and debris from the fallen branch. At 2 o'clock, the wind shifted direction, attacking from the south now, and the change brought a temporary lull in the snowfall. Walter looked out the kitchen window and could actually see the barn for the first time in 12 hours, a ghostly shape half buried in snow. He made a decision that would alter everything that followed. He told Mildred he needed to get to the barn to check on the animals and retrieve firewood he'd stored there. She argued against it, pointing out that visibility was still terrible and the wind strong enough to knock a man down, but Walter insisted. They were running low on wood, the house was getting dangerously cold, and if the storm continued, they'd need every piece of fuel they could access. He bundled up in his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and pulled on his boots. Mildred insisted on coming with him, refusing to stay alone while he was outside. If something happened to him, she'd never know, she argued. If they went together, at least they could help each other. Walter tried to talk her out of it, but Mildred could be just as stubborn. They left the house at 2:40 in the afternoon on November 26, 1950. Walter used the rope system, tying one end to the porch post and holding the other as they ventured into the storm. The snow was so deep they had to wade through drifts that reached Mildred's waist. The wind hit them like a physical force, staggering them, stealing their breath. The 50-yard walk to the barn felt like a mile. They reached the barn and found the animals still alive, but clearly distressed. One cow had knocked over her water bucket, and Duke was making low, anxious sounds Walter had never heard from him. Walter and Mildred worked quickly, refilling water, distributing feed, and gathering an armload of firewood stacked against the barn's interior wall. Then Walter heard it. A sound that didn't belong, a groaning deep in the barn's bones, timber stressed beyond what it could bear. He looked up and saw the center beam bowing, snow piled so deep on the roof above that the wood was actually bending. Ice had formed in the joints where the roof met the support posts, and the whole structure was shifting with each gust of wind. "Mildred, we need to go, now." But even as he said it, the first crack split the air. Not a branch breaking, but a beam giving way, a sound like a rifle shot that echoed through the barn's interior. Walter grabbed Mildred's arm and tried to push her toward the door, but the collapse was already happening, too fast to outrun. The center section of the roof came down first, a massive weight of timber and snow and ice dropping like a guillotine. Walter shoved Mildred hard, sending her stumbling toward the open door, and then the world exploded into chaos. A support beam caught him across the shoulder and the side of his head, the impact so sudden he didn't even feel pain, just a blinding flash of white light and then darkness swimming at the edges of his vision. He was on the ground, face pressed into snow that had cascaded through the collapsing roof. His head was ringing, a high-pitched whine that blocked out every other sound. He tried to push himself up, but his arms wouldn't work properly, wouldn't respond to what his brain was telling them. Blood was running down the side of his face, warm against his cold skin, dripping onto the snow beneath him. "Walter!" Mildred's voice came from somewhere far away, though she was right next to him. She was pulling at his coat, trying to drag him toward safety, but another section of the roof was coming down, more beams snapping in sequence, and then something hit her too. A falling timber caught her on the side of the head, spinning her around and sending her crashing into the wall of the barn. She didn't lose consciousness, but the world tilted sideways and wouldn't right itself. Her vision was filled with bright spots of light that danced and swirled. She could taste blood in her mouth and couldn't remember how it got there. Walter was saying something, his mouth moving, but the words were just noise, meaningless sounds that didn't form into language. More of the roof was falling, sections collapsing one after another like dominoes. The barn was filling with snow, great cascades of it pouring through the gaps where the roof had been. Duke was screaming, a horrible sound that cut through even the ringing in Mildred's ears. The cows were thrashing in their stalls, panicked by the chaos. Walter got to his feet somehow, moving on instinct because conscious thought had become impossible. He grabbed Mildred under her arms and dragged her toward where he thought the door was. His head was swimming, his vision blurring at the edges, and every step felt like walking through deep water. The rope was gone, torn free during the collapse, or maybe he'd dropped it. He couldn't remember. They made it outside into the storm, and if the barn had been chaos, the world beyond was worse. The temporary lull in the snowfall had ended, and now the wind was driving snow so hard it felt like being sandblasted. Walter couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. Everything was white. The ground and sky merged into one solid wall of blowing snow. He tried to orient himself, tried to remember which direction the house was, but his head was pounding and his thoughts wouldn't stay in order. Blood was still running down his face, freezing in his beard and eyelashes. Mildred was leaning heavily against him, barely able to stand on her own. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and when she tried to speak, only a confused mumble came out. Walter picked a direction that felt right and started walking, half carrying Mildred through snow that came up to their thighs. The wind was so strong it physically pushed them sideways, and he had to lean into it just to move forward. Every few steps he'd stop, trying to see some landmark, some indication that they were going the right way. But there was nothing, just white, just wind, just cold that was already seeping through his heavy coat and into his bones. He didn't know how long they walked. Time had lost all meaning in the white void of the storm. It might have been 5 minutes, or it might have been an hour. Mildred fell twice, and the second time Walter couldn't get her back on her feet. She just sat in the snow, looking up at him with eyes that didn't seem to recognize him, blood crusted on the side of her face where the beam had struck her. Walter knelt beside her, trying to shield her from the worst of the wind, and felt panic rising in his chest. They were going to die out here. They were going to freeze to death yards from their own home because he'd been too stubborn to wait out the storm, because he'd insisted on checking the animals, because he'd made every wrong choice possible in the span of an hour. That's when he saw it through the driving snow. A shape that didn't belong, darker than the white around it. At first he thought it was a hallucination, his dying brain offering false hope, but it didn't disappear when he blinked. It was real, solid, a structure of some kind that he'd never seen before. Walter didn't question it. He got Mildred up one more time and dragged both of them toward that shape, using the absolute last of his strength. His legs were numb, his hands were numb, his face felt like it was made of wood. The shape resolved into a small cabin as they got closer, rough timber walls and a sloped roof, and most importantly, a door. Walter pounded on that door with fists that had no feeling left in them. He pounded until his arms gave out, and then he just stood there swaying, holding Mildred upright more by force of will than by any remaining physical strength. The door opened. A man stood there, lit from behind by lamplight, his face shadowed and unreadable. Walter tried to speak, tried to explain, but the words came out wrong, slurred and confused. The man looked at them for a long moment, these two bleeding, half-frozen people on his doorstep, and Walter saw something in his eyes he couldn't quite read. Not surprise, not alarm, something more like resignation. Then the man stepped aside and gestured them in without a word. The cabin's interior was small, just one room with a wood stove, a cot, a table and chair, and shelves lined with canned goods. The man sat them near the stove and brought blankets. He heated water and cleaned their wounds with what smelled like whiskey, his movements efficient but impersonal. He didn't ask questions, didn't speak at all except to give short instructions. Sit here. Hold this. Don't move. Walter tried to tell him something important, tried to explain that they had a house, that people would be looking for them, that they needed to get word to someone. But his thoughts kept scattering before he could form them into words. His head throbbed with every heartbeat, and the warmth from the stove was making him dizzy. He could feel consciousness slipping away like water through his fingers. Mildred was worse. She was staring at the wall with eyes that didn't seem to be seeing anything. When the man spoke to her, she didn't respond. When he touched her shoulder, she flinched but didn't look at him. The blow to her head had done something beyond just physical damage. Some connection inside her mind had been severed, and she was adrift in a fog that wouldn't lift. Walter fell asleep by the stove, still trying to remember something vital, some piece of information that mattered more than anything else in the world. But every time he reached for it, it slipped away, and finally he just gave up and let the darkness take him. When he woke, light was coming through the cabin's single window, though whether it was morning or afternoon was impossible to say in the storm's perpetual twilight. The man was sitting at his table, watching them with eyes that held no warmth, but no hostility either. Just a flat, assessing gaze that made Walter uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. Walter tried to speak, tried to ask where they were, but his voice came out as a croak. His head was wrapped in cloth that smelled of whiskey and something herbal. When he reached up to touch it, pain spiked through his skull, sharp enough to make him gasp. "Don't," the man said. It was the first word he'd spoken since letting them in. "You've got a fracture, I expect. Skull's cracked or close to it. Moving around too much will make it worse." Walter wanted to ask how the man knew that, wanted to ask 100 questions, but forming words felt like trying to lift enormous weights. He looked over at Mildred and saw she was awake too. but there was something wrong with her eyes. They were open but empty, looking at nothing, seeing nothing. "She hit her head harder than you," the man said, following Walter's gaze. "Might come back from it, might not." The storm continued to rage outside. Walter could hear it even through the cabin's thick walls, the wind screaming like something alive and angry. He tried to remember why they'd been outside in it, tried to remember what they'd been doing, but the memories were fragmentary and confused. There had been a barn, there had been animals. Something had fallen. After that, everything was white and wind and cold. Days passed. Walter never knew how many. The storm continued, occasionally weakening, but never fully stopping. The man, whose name Walter learned was Martin Cray, kept them fed on thin soup and canned vegetables. He changed their bandages daily, cleaning their wounds with whiskey that burned like fire. He didn't talk much, and when he did, it was only to give instructions or basic information. Walter's memory didn't return. Pieces would surface occasionally, fragments that didn't connect to anything. A woman's face that might have been Mildred when she was younger. A house that might have been theirs. Children's voices that might have belonged to people he'd known. But nothing solid, nothing he could hold on to. Mildred was worse. She could walk if you took her hand and led her. She could eat if you put food in front of her. But she didn't speak, didn't recognize her own name when Walter tried it, didn't seem to understand that she was a person with a past and an identity beyond this moment. When the storm finally broke on November 30th, Martin Cray made a decision that would trap Walter and Mildred Hartfield in a half-life for the next 54 years. He'd been watching them for 5 days, these two disoriented people who couldn't remember who they were or where they'd come from. He'd been asking himself what he should do with them, and the answer he'd arrived at was born from deep paranoia and a trauma that had never healed. Martin Cray had served in France during World War I. He'd been at Belleau Wood and the Argonne Forest, and he'd seen things that had broken something fundamental inside him. He'd come home in 1919 believing that government was an institution designed to control and destroy individual freedom, that the war had been a slaughter orchestrated by men in power who cared nothing for the lives they spent like currency. He'd bought his 40 acres of worthless hillside with his discharge pay and built his cabin with his own hands, specifically to remove himself from a system he no longer trusted. He had no telephone, no electricity, no connection to the government systems that he believed were watching everyone, controlling everyone. He registered nothing, paid no taxes, existed on paper only as a name in an army personnel file that no one would ever look at again. When Walter and Mildred appeared on his doorstep, bleeding and confused, his first instinct had been basic human decency. Let them in, treat their wounds, keep them alive through the storm. But as the days passed and he saw how thoroughly they'd lost their memories, how neither of them seemed to know who they were or where they'd come from, a different thought had taken root. If he took them to a hospital or contacted authorities, there would be questions. Police would come to his cabin, would see how he lived, would discover that he existed outside their systems. They might decide he'd had something to do with these people's injuries. At minimum, they'd put him in their files, make him visible to a government he'd spent 30 years hiding from. And these two people, Walter and Mildred, they didn't remember anything. They couldn't tell anyone where they'd come from or what had happened to them. The storm had wiped away their past as thoroughly as if it had never existed. If their families were looking for them, they'd assume the storm had killed them. People died in storms like this all the time. 2 more bodies lost in the snow wouldn't raise suspicions. Martin Cray convinced himself, through logic that only made sense to someone whose mind had been warped by war and isolation, that keeping them here was actually better for everyone. Their families would grieve and move on, but at least they'd have closure, wouldn't spend years wondering and searching. Walter and Mildred couldn't remember the lives they'd lost, so they wouldn't miss what they couldn't recall. And Martin would have company, people to share the work of survival in this isolated place. He knew it was wrong. Some part of him, buried deep beneath the paranoia and trauma, recognized that what he was doing was a kind of theft, stealing these people from whatever life they'd had before. But he'd made harder choices in the war, had done things that haunted his dreams, and, compared to those memories, this seemed almost merciful. So he told them they'd always lived here, told them they'd been helping him work his land for years, told them their names were John and Edna because they couldn't remember their real names and needed something to answer to. And because they had no competing memories, no other reality to compare his words against, they believed him. It worked because their injuries had been severe enough to cause lasting damage. Walter's skull fracture had healed, but it had left him with what doctors would later call retrograde amnesia, an inability to access memories from before the trauma. Mildred's injury had been worse, causing not just memory loss, but deeper cognitive impairment that would never fully heal. They accepted their new life because they couldn't remember any other life existing. They worked alongside Martin Cray, tending his small vegetable garden, splitting firewood, hauling water from the creek. They lived in his cabin like ghosts, present but not quite real, going through motions without ever quite understanding why. Years passed. Walter and Mildred, now John and Edna, aged. Their hair went white, their bodies grew frail, but their memories never returned. Martin Cray aged too, the emphysema he'd developed from his pipe, smoking gradually destroying his lungs. By the 1980s, he was barely able to walk without struggling for breath, but still he maintained the isolation. Still, he kept John and Edna hidden from a world that had long since given up looking for Walter and Mildred Hartfield. When Martin Cray died in 1987, John and Edna were alone for the first time in 37 years. It was a neighbor from 3 miles away who found them, a farmer checking to see why he hadn't seen smoke from Cray's chimney in several days. He discovered Cray's body on the cabin floor, dead from respiratory failure, and 2 elderly people sitting by the cold stove who couldn't explain who they were or why they were there. The authorities who responded had no idea what to do with them. They had no identification, no social security numbers, no records of existence. Medical examinations suggested they were in their late 80s or early 90s, but without documentation, precise ages were impossible to determine. Both showed signs of old head trauma and what doctors described as severe retrograde amnesia. Social services in Monroe County tried to identify them. They checked missing persons records, but by 1987, the Hartfield case had been closed for 36 years. Nobody was looking for Walter and Mildred anymore. Their children were dead or dying. Their grandchildren had grown up hearing about great-grandparents who'd vanished in a storm before they were born. The trail had gone cold decades ago. John and Edna were placed in a state facility in Huntington, then transferred to Westside Manor Nursing Home in Charleston in 2000, where they became John and Edna Miller, surnames assigned by a social worker who needed something for the paperwork. They had a room together, 2 beds, a shared dresser, and a window that looked out on a parking lot. They'd been at Westside Manor for 4 years when, on a Tuesday in October 2004, a social worker named Deborah Cross walked into their room and changed everything. Deborah Cross hadn't planned to work in social services. She'd studied art history at West Virginia University, dreamed of curating exhibits in New York or Boston, but student loans and reality had redirected her into elder care coordination for Kanawha County. She was 31 years old, divorced, living in a studio apartment in Charleston, and working a job that paid poorly, but at least provided health insurance. She visited Westside Manor twice monthly to check on state-funded residents, ensuring they were receiving adequate care and that their paperwork was in order. It was routine work, mostly depressing, talking to elderly people who'd outlived everyone who'd ever cared about them, and now spent their final years in institutions that smelled of disinfectant and boiled vegetables. The Miller's room was on the second floor, number 217. Deborah knocked once and entered to find an elderly couple sitting by the window, holding hands, looking out at the parking lot where nothing interesting had happened or ever would happen. The woman wore a faded blue cardigan over a house dress, and the man was dressed in brown slacks and a white shirt that looked like it had been purchased from Goodwill sometime in the 1990s. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller?" Deborah said, checking her clipboard. "I'm Deborah Cross from County Social Services. I'm just here to check in, make sure everything's all right." The man looked at her with eyes that were clear but somehow empty, as if he was looking at something very far away. The woman didn't look up at all, just continued staring out the window. "Is everything all right?" Deborah repeated, speaking a little louder in case they were hard of hearing. "We're fine," the man said. His voice was surprisingly strong for someone who looked to be pushing 90. "Everything's always fine?" Deborah sat down in the chair across from them and went through her standard questions. Were they comfortable? Was the food adequate? Did they have any complaints about their care? The man answered in monosyllables, nothing that suggested any problems beyond the fundamental problem of being old and forgotten in a nursing home. She was about to leave, her checklist completed, when she noticed the brooch pinned to Mrs. Miller's cardigan. It was an unusual piece, Victorian by the look of it, silver filigree work surrounding a small dark stone that might have been jet. The craftsmanship was exquisite, far too fine for someone living on state assistance to own. "That's a beautiful brooch," Deborah said, partly out of genuine appreciation and partly just to make conversation. "May I ask where you got it?" Mrs. Miller touched the brooch with trembling fingers but didn't respond. Mr. Miller answered for her. "It's always been hers. She's worn it as long as I can remember. It looks antique, Victorian era, probably 1890s or early 1900s. "Could be," Mr. Miller said with no particular interest. Deborah made a note on her clipboard, though she wasn't sure why. Something about that brooch bothered her, a feeling she couldn't quite articulate. She thanked them for their time and left, moving on to the other residents on her list, but the image of that brooch stayed with her through the rest of her visits. That evening she had dinner with her grandmother, Alice Cross, who lived in a retirement community in South Charleston. Alice was 78, sharp as ever, and loved hearing about Deborah's work, even though most of the stories were depressing. Over meatloaf and green beans, Deborah found herself mentioning the brooch. This elderly woman at Westside Manor was wearing this beautiful Victorian piece. Victorian mourning jewelry, I think, with jetstone. Really exquisite craftsmanship. Alice set down her fork, her expression shifting to something Deborah couldn't quite read. "Mourning jewelry? What did it look like exactly?" Deborah described it. The silver filigree, the dark stone, the unusual clasp design. Alice was quiet for a long moment, staring at her plate. "You said this woman is at Westside Manor? What's her name?" "Edna Miller." "Well, that's what they call her. She and her husband don't actually have any real identification. They were found living with some hermit up in Monroe County back in the late 80s. Couldn't remember who they were." Alice's hand had gone very still on her fork. "How old is she?" "Hard to say. Late 80s, maybe early 90s. "And she can't remember her past?" "That's what the file says. Some kind of amnesia." Alice stood up from the table and disappeared into her bedroom. She came back carrying a shoebox full of old photographs, the kind from the 1940s and 50s with scalloped edges and faded colors. She spread them across the kitchen table, searching through them until she found what she was looking for. "This," she said, handing Deborah a photograph that had yellowed with age. "This was taken in 1949. Look at it." The photograph showed a group of women standing in front of a church, all dressed in their Sunday best. Alice pointed to one woman in the back row, elderly even then, wearing a dark dress and, pinned to her collar, a brooch that looked exactly like the one Deborah had seen that afternoon. "That's Mildred Hartfield," Alice said quietly. "She and her husband Walter disappeared during the Thanksgiving storm in 1950. They lived on a farm outside Steubenville, Ohio. I knew them because my parents had a summer place not far from there. Mildred always wore that brooch. It had belonged to her mother." Deborah stared at the photograph, then at her grandmother. "You think the woman at West Side Manor is Mildred Hartfield?" "I think you need to look into it," Alice said. "The Hartfields were declared dead, but they never found the bodies. Everyone assumed the storm took them, buried them under snow somewhere. But what if it didn't?" Deborah went home that night and couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Edna Miller sitting in room 217, wearing a dead woman's brooch, staring out a window at nothing. At 2 a.m., she got up and drove to the public library, using their computer to search newspaper archives for information about the Hartfield case. She found the original articles from December 1950, describing the search efforts and the storm's devastation. She found the follow-up stories from spring 1951, when the search resumed after the snow melted. She found the August 1951 article announcing that Walter and Mildred Hartfield had been declared legally dead. She also found something else, a photograph from the memorial service showing the Hartfield children, James Jr., Thomas, and Ruth. And in the background of that photograph, standing with other mourners, was a younger version of Alice Cross's mother, which confirmed her grandmother's story about knowing the family. The next morning, Deborah called West Side Manor and requested copies of whatever documentation existed for John and Edna Miller. The administrator, a woman named Patricia Vance, sounded puzzled by the request, but agreed to pull the files. Deborah drove to the nursing home that afternoon and sat in Patricia's office, reading through the thin folder that contained everything the state knew about the Millers. They'd been found in Martin Cray's cabin on April 3, 1987. Cray had been dead approximately 3 days. The elderly couple couldn't provide names, couldn't explain why they were there, showed signs of malnutrition and neglect. Medical examination revealed old skull fractures in both individuals, healed but suggesting traumatic injuries years or decades earlier. There were no fingerprints on file because fingerprinting wasn't standard procedure for elderly people placed in care facilities. There was no DNA on record because in 1987, DNA testing wasn't routinely used for identification purposes. There was nothing that definitively proved who these people were or weren't. "Did anyone ever try to identify them?" Deborah asked. Patricia shrugged. "Monroe County put out some inquiries when they were first found, checked missing persons databases, but came up empty. By 1987, if they'd been missing since the 1950s or earlier, those cases would have been closed decades ago. Nobody was still looking." Deborah went back to room 217 that afternoon with a printout of the 1949 photograph her grandmother had given her. She sat down across from John and Edna Miller and placed the photograph on the table between them. "Do you recognize anyone in this picture?" she asked. John looked at it without much interest. Edna didn't look at all, just continued staring out the window as if Deborah wasn't there. "Should we?" John asked. Deborah pointed to the woman wearing the brooch. "This woman's name was Mildred Hartfield. She disappeared in November 1950 during a terrible storm in Ohio. She and her husband Walter were never found. John's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. There and gone so quickly, Deborah almost missed it. "That's a long time ago," he said. "You and Mrs. Miller were found in a cabin in 1987, with no memory of who you were or where you'd come from. The doctors said you both had old head injuries, the kind that could cause amnesia." "I don't remember any cabin," John said, which was true. His memories only reached back as far as waking up in the hospital in Huntington. Deborah pointed to the brooch on Edna's cardigan. "That brooch is very distinctive. It matches the one Mildred Hartfield is wearing in this photograph from 1949. "It's just a brooch," John said. "Could be lots of them look alike." But Deborah could see doubt creeping into his eyes now, uncertainty about the narrative he'd been living with for 17 years. She left the photograph with them and went home to figure out what to do next. She started by contacting the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in Ohio, explaining the situation to a deputy who listened with increasing interest. He pulled the old Hartfield file, inactive since 1951, and found the case details. Disappeared during storm, extensive search, no bodies found, declared dead. He agreed to check if any family members were still alive who might be able to provide information. It took 3 weeks of investigation, but the deputy located Ruth Hartfield's daughter, Caroline Hayes, living in Dayton. Ruth had died in 1998, but Caroline was 64 years old and remembered her grandparents, though she'd only been 9 years old when they disappeared. "I never met them," Caroline told Deborah over the phone. "The storm happened in 1950, and I wasn't born until 1940. I heard the stories my whole life about how my mother's parents vanished on Thanksgiving. It was like this family tragedy that everyone talked about, but nobody really understood." "I need to ask you something that might sound strange," Deborah said. "Do you have any photographs of your grandparents? Anything that might help with identification?" Caroline did better than photographs. She'd inherited a box of her mother's belongings that included medical records from the 1940s, when both Walter and Mildred had been patients of a doctor in Steubenville. The records included descriptions of old injuries and healed fractures that might show up on X-rays decades later. More importantly, Caroline still had her grandmother's wedding ring, the one Ruth had taken from the Hartfield farmhouse in 1951. Inside the band was an inscription, W to M, 1898. Deborah drove to Dayton to meet Caroline and see these items in person. Caroline was a middle-aged woman with gray hair and kind eyes who wept when she saw the photograph Deborah had brought from 1949. "That's them," she said, touching the image gently. "I've seen pictures at my mother's house. That's definitely Grandma Mildred and the brooch she always wore. My mother talked about that brooch, said it had belonged to my great-grandmother Foster." They drove to Charleston together the next day. Caroline was nervous, her hands shaking as they rode the elevator to the second floor of West Side Manor. She'd brought the medical records, the ring, and several other photographs Deborah hadn't seen before. In room 217, John and Edna were in their usual places by the window. John looked up when they entered, and something in his expression changed when he saw Caroline. Not recognition exactly, but something more subtle, a feeling of familiarity that he couldn't explain. Caroline stood in the doorway, staring at these 2 elderly people who might be her grandparents. She was crying before she even sat down. "Grandma?" she said, approaching Edna slowly. "Grandma Mildred?" Edna looked up at her, and for just a moment there was something in her eyes that suggested she was seeing more than just a stranger. But then it faded, and she went back to staring out the window. John was watching Caroline with an intensity Deborah hadn't seen from him before. "Who are you?" he asked, and his voice had changed, become less flat more engaged. "My name is Caroline Hayes," she said, sitting down across from them. "My mother was Ruth Hartfield. She was your daughter. My grandfather's name was Walter, and my grandmother's name was Mildred." She laid out the photographs on the table, images from the 1940s showing Walter and Mildred at various ages. She showed them pictures of their children, of James Jr. and Thomas and Ruth. She showed them the wedding ring with its inscription. John looked at everything without speaking. His hands were trembling now, whether from age or emotion was impossible to say. He picked up one photograph, a picture of 4 people standing in front of a farmhouse, and stared at it for a long time. "I remember," he said finally, so quietly that Deborah almost didn't hear him. "I remember a house, not this one, but a house, and snow, so much snow." It wasn't much. It wasn't a dramatic breakthrough, but it was the first crack in the wall that had kept Walter Hartfield's memories locked away for 54 years. Over the following weeks, Deborah coordinated with medical specialists from West Virginia University Hospital. They brought John and Edna in for examinations, X-rays, CT scans, every test that might provide evidence of their true identities. The X-rays showed healed fractures in both individuals that matched descriptions from the 1940s medical records Caroline had provided. Walter Hartfield had broken his left arm in 1938, fallen off a ladder, and the X-ray showed evidence of that old break in John Miller's left arm. Mildred Hartfield had fractured her wrist in 1945, slipped on ice, and Edna Miller's X-ray showed the same old injury. But the most compelling evidence came from dental records. Walter Hartfield had lost 3 teeth in his youth and had distinctive bridge work done in 1947. John Miller had that exact same bridge work visible on dental X-rays. The craftsmanship matched, the placement matched, everything matched. By December 2004, enough evidence had accumulated that the West Virginia Department of Health agreed to amend John and Edna Miller's legal identities. They were formally recognized as Walter James Hartfield and Mildred Ann Foster Hartfield, declared dead in 1951 but found alive in 2004. The story broke nationally in January 2005. "Couple missing 54 years found alive" ran as a headline in newspapers across the country. Television news crews descended on Charleston. Reporters wanted to interview the miracle couple, the people who'd been lost for more than half a century and suddenly reappeared. But there was no miracle story to tell, not really. Walter and Mildred Hartfield couldn't remember being Walter and Mildred Hartfield. They couldn't remember their farm, their children, their life before the storm. The years with Martin Cray were gone too, erased as thoroughly as everything that came before. They existed in a perpetual present, with no past to anchor them. Caroline Hayes visited them regularly through the winter of 2005. She brought photographs, told stories, tried to rebuild connections that had been severed 54 years earlier. Sometimes Walter seemed to respond, would nod at certain names or images, but whether he was actually remembering or just being polite was impossible to know. Mildred never responded at all, lost in a cognitive fog that had only deepened with age. The legal complications were enormous. Walter and Mildred Hartfield had been declared dead in 1951. Their property had been sold, their assets distributed, their estate settled. Declaring them alive again opened questions that had no good answers. Did they have claims to property that had been sold decades ago? Were their children's inheritances suddenly invalid? Who was responsible for 54 years of missed Social Security payments? Lawyers from 3 states spent months sorting through the mess. In the end, most questions were resolved by acknowledging that too much time had passed for meaningful restitution. The farm was long gone, sold multiple times over the decades. The money from that sale had been distributed to James Jr., Thomas, and Ruth in 1952, and they'd spent it or saved it or invested it according to their own choices. Unwinding those transactions 53 years later was impossible. The Social Security Administration agreed to pay Walter and Mildred benefits going forward, but they refused to calculate back payments for the decades they'd been alive, but presumed dead. The state of West Virginia agreed to continue covering their nursing home care. Caroline hired a lawyer who negotiated a small settlement from Martin Cray's estate, though Cray had died nearly penniless and there was almost nothing to claim. The true crime documentaries came next, producers fascinated by the story of the couple who'd lived 54 years in a kind of suspended animation. They interviewed Caroline, interviewed the deputy from Jefferson County who'd pulled the old case files, interviewed Deborah Cross, whose observation of a brooch had unraveled a mystery older than most of the people working on the films. But they couldn't really interview Walter and Mildred, who had nothing to say about their own story because they couldn't remember it. The documentaries all ended the same way, with footage of two elderly people sitting by a window, holding hands, looking at nothing in particular, while narrators spoke about the mysteries of memory and the lasting impacts of trauma. Walter James Hartfield died on March 17, 2007, at the age of 130 according to his original birth certificate, though he'd only been consciously alive for fragments of those years. He died of heart failure in his sleep, holding Mildred's hand, in room 217 at Westside Manor. His death certificate listed his name as Walter James Hartfield, correcting the error that had called him John Miller for 20 years. Mildred Ann Foster Hartfield died 5 months later on August 3, 2007. She was 128 years old, though she'd never known most of those years existed. She died quietly, without ever having spoken more than a handful of words since being identified in 2004. They were buried in the Presbyterian Church Cemetery in Steubenville, the same church where they'd been married in 1898. Their children, James Jr., Thomas, and Ruth, were already buried there, having died decades earlier, not knowing their parents had survived. The funeral was attended by Caroline Hayes and her family, by Deborah Cross, by a handful of people who'd followed the story in the news and felt compelled to pay respects to two people whose lives had been stolen by a storm and a paranoid hermit and the failures of human memory. The gravestone Caroline chose was simple: Walter and Mildred Hartfield, together 1898-2007, lost and found. The nursing home room 217 was cleaned out and prepared for new residents. Mildred's brooch, the Victorian mourning piece that had been the key to unraveling everything, was given to Caroline, who wore it to the funeral and then placed it in a safety deposit box, unable to look at it without feeling the weight of all those lost years. The Westside Manor administration removed the name Miller from their records and updated everything to Hartfield, though it made no practical difference. The state of West Virginia closed the case files with a notation that the individuals had been identified and were now deceased. The Social Security Administration updated their records, showing that Walter and Mildred Hartfield had died in 2007, not 1950 as previously recorded. The Great Appalachian Storm of 1950 had taken 353 lives officially, but its final 2 victims didn't die until 2007, having spent 57 years caught between life and death, present but not quite existing, breathing but not quite living. Martin Cray's cabin in Monroe County had been torn down years earlier, the land reverting to forest and scrub. Nobody marked the place where Walter and Mildred had spent 5 decades in a kind of prison that had no locks or bars. Nobody put up a sign explaining what had happened there, how 2 people had been erased from their own lives by a combination of trauma and isolation and one man's paranoid choice. The Hartfield case became a teaching example in elder care programs, illustrating the importance of thorough documentation and the complexities of identifying people with severe amnesia. It appeared in medical journals discussing traumatic brain injury and long-term memory loss. It was cited in legal papers about death certificates and the complications of declaring someone dead who later turns up alive. But for Caroline Hayes, it remained something more personal. She'd spent 2 years visiting her grandparents, trying to build a connection with people who couldn't remember they were supposed to be connected. She'd shown them hundreds of photographs, told them stories about their children, tried desperately to spark some memory that would return them to themselves. It never happened. Walter and Mildred Hartfield had died in that barn on Thanksgiving Day, 1950, not physically, but in every way that mattered. The people who'd survived were empty vessels wearing their faces, going through motions of living without any context for what living meant. On what would have been her grandmother's 129th birthday, Caroline drove to the old Hartfield farm site outside Steubenville. The farmhouse was long gone, replaced by a modern split level built in 1985. The barn had been demolished in 1952. Nothing remained of the place where Walter and Mildred had lived except the stone foundation, barely visible through the weeds. She stood there for an hour, trying to imagine what that Thanksgiving Day had been like, the storm and the cold and the decisions that had led to everything that followed. She thought about Martin Cray, dead 18 years before the truth came out, never held accountable for the theft he'd committed. She thought about her own mother, Ruth, who died in 1998 believing her parents had frozen to death in 1950, never knowing they'd survived just 50 miles away. The wind picked up, cold even in October, and Caroline pulled her coat tighter. She touched the brooch pinned to her collar, Mildred's brooch, the small piece of evidence that had unraveled 54 years of mystery. The dark stone caught the autumn light and held it, the way it had held the light in 1949 when the photograph was taken, the way it had held the light in Westside Manor in 2004 when Deborah Cross first noticed it. Caroline drove back to Dayton that evening, and she never returned to Steubenville. Some places, she decided, held too much loss to visit twice. Some stories didn't have redemption at the end, just the acknowledgement that tragedy had occurred, and time had passed, and people had died before they could be properly mourned. The great Appalachian storm of 1950 faded into history, remembered occasionally on anniversaries, mentioned in weather documentaries about extreme winter events. The 353 official deaths became a statistic, a number that represented individuals but had stopped feeling like real people to anyone who hadn't known them. Walter and Mildred Hartfield became a footnote to that statistic, the couple who technically survived but lost everything that made survival meaningful. Their story wasn't inspiring. It wasn't uplifting. It was simply true in all the ways truth can be uncomfortable and unsatisfying and resistant to the neat endings people prefer. In a filing cabinet in the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in Ohio, the Hartfield case file was finally, officially closed in 2008. A stamp across the front page read, "Resolved Deceased," in red ink. Inside were photographs from 1950, search reports, medical records, and a final notation dated March 2008 explaining that the missing persons had been located alive in 2004 and had subsequently died in 2007. The file was moved to the archives, boxed with other closed cases from the 1950s, stored in a temperature-controlled room where it would remain until someone decided these old records could be destroyed or until historians decades in the future might find them interesting as artifacts of how missing persons cases were handled in the mid-20th century. And in Charleston, West Virginia, room 217 at Westside Manor was occupied by a new resident, an 87-year-old woman with dementia who spent her days looking out the window at the parking lot. seeing nothing, remembering nothing, existing in that same perpetual present where Walter and Mildred Hartfield had spent their final years. Deborah Cross left social services in 2009, burned out from years of witnessing decline and death. She went back to school, finished her art history degree, and got a job at a small museum in Richmond. She kept the newspaper clippings from 2005 in a folder, occasionally taking them out to remember how a single observation had unraveled a 54-year mystery. Alice Cross, Deborah's grandmother, died in 2011 at 85. In her final years, she sometimes told the story at her retirement community about how she'd recognized a brooch and identified two people who'd been lost for more than half a century. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office officially closed the Hartfield case file in 2008. A stamp across the front page read, "Resolved Deceased," in red ink. The file was moved to the archives, boxed with other closed cases from the 1950s, stored where it would remain until someone decided these old records could be destroyed. On November 26, 2020, the 70th anniversary of the Great Appalachian Storm, a historical society in Ohio published a retrospective article about the disaster. It mentioned the Hartfields in a single paragraph, noting them as unusual cases of people who'd technically survived the storm but had been lost nonetheless. The last person to visit their graves with any personal connection was Caroline Hayes's daughter, Emily, who made a single trip to Steubenville in 2025. She was 40 years old, had never met Walter and Mildred, barely remembered her mother's stories about them. She stood at their gravestone for 5 minutes, took a photograph with her phone, and drove back to Columbus. The Hartfield case became a teaching example in elder care programs and appeared in medical journals discussing traumatic brain injury. But for those who'd known the story personally, it remained what it had always been: a tragedy stranger than most, where two people had been erased by a storm and a hermit's paranoid choice, spending 54 years as ghosts who were present but not quite living. Walter and Mildred Hartfield had survived the Great Appalachian Storm of 1950, but everything that made them themselves had died in that collapsing barn on Thanksgiving Day. What came after was just the slow acknowledgement of a loss that had already happened decades before anyone knew to mourn it.